There you go, Mac. Let me check my audio settings. They seem to be fine. Oh, yeah. Good news. JG actually recommended this video we're going to listen to. A theologian, a professional guy from the priestcraft who has changed his mind about these great matters and has a couple of videos up. Why I Am Now a Universalist, Part 1 and Part 2. And oh, hang on, before we start the matter, let me put in the link so you can feel free to come in. And give me a thumbs up right about now. Come in, baby. Okay. And I put the in the show notes down below the link to this guy's video. His name is Randal. Randal Rauser. And let's see, I'll put it in for your convenience here. Excellent, baby. So we can share the love. Let's see, where do I go now? Oh, yeah. Do it full screen.
What?
Shut up. I'm not ready yet. I want to bump it up in time sequence to just 125. Ready? Set. Hit it, Randall.
I've been a hopeful universalist for several years now. Back in 2013, I wrote a book on heaven, and in that book, I had a chapter in which I argued that every Christian ought to be a hopeful universalist. That is, every Christian ought to hope universalism is true, even if they don't believe it is true. Now, this comes back to, for example, J.I. Packer, who rather famously said, if you don't want to see everybody saved, there's something wrong with you. And I 100% agree with Packer. If you don't want universalism to be true, if you currently believe it is false, but don't hope that you're wrong, there's something wrong with you. And that's actually something I'm going to come back to later on, because I think that's a really important point. But anyway, yes, I was a hopeful universalist for many years. Here's a simple illustration or argument for hopeful universalism. For hopeful universalism, all you need is the possibility that you are wrong about that issue. Even if you think that possibility is very unlikely, the mere possibility itself is enough to hope that you are wrong. And for an analogy, imagine that there is a lottery in which 1 billion tickets are sold and you have one of those tickets. You probably won't believe that you're going to win the lottery. The chances of you winning are 1 billion to 1. But you ought to hope that you'll win, surely. By analogy, even if you think the arguments favoring an alternative explanation of posthumous punishment, like annihilationism or infernalism, that is eternal conscious torment, even if you think it is 1 billion to 1 odds that one of those views is more likely to be true than universalism, still, that one ticket, that 1 in a billion chance is enough reasonably for you to hope that you're wrong and that universalism is, in fact, true. So that's been my position for years now. Now, interestingly, when I was a professor 15 years ago in a seminary, I expressed a hopeful universalist view to a colleague who right away tried to get me fired because he interpreted that as dogmatic universalism or a conviction of universalism, which it wasn't. But that just shows the hostility among many conservative evangelicals to the prospect of universal salvation. Well, let's say then, what is universal salvation, this concept? First of all, it's not pluralism. Pluralism is a view that there are many different, equally quote unquote valid conceptions of God, theological reality, the afterlife, etc., and that different people can choose different alternative views, and that each view is as true as every other view. And that's not universalism. Universalism is just a completely different thing. What I'm talking about is Christian universalism, which is the idea that ultimately all people will, or all creatures will at some point be reconciled to God in Jesus Christ, whether in and through this life or the next. Thus, if or insofar as there is a posthumous judgment or a quote unquote hell, that judgment is a judgment of restoration rather than simply a punitive judgment. In other words, to the extent that people suffer in some form in the afterlife after a general resurrection, that suffering, the purpose of it is to bring them into restored relationship with God and others. And ultimately, that process will be completed and all creatures will be reconciled to God in Jesus Christ. And that's Christian universalism. So, yes, I believe one ought to hope that that is true. But what about believing it is true? And for a decade, probably, I've been in the twilight zone on that question, back and forth. I'm finally at the point where I think I've just verged into thinking it is true. It's really interesting when you talk about belief, people will often assume they know what they believe on particular topics because, after all, these are their beliefs, right? If anybody's going to know what you believe, surely it is you. And yet, sometimes belief is like the shift from day to night. And at some point, the light disappears below the horizon and the first stars are twinkling on in the sky overhead, and you realize you are entering into night. But precisely when that moment of coming into night is, you may not be clear. And that can be the case with belief. Moving from one belief to another, you're just not that clear on when that moment occurred. And I'm not clear on when I would say I became a universalist by conviction, but at some point, I'm comfortable saying that I am. And what I wanted to do was to make a video talking about why I am now a universalist. But I thought there was a little bit too much content for my liking to do it all in one video. So I'm actually going to do it in two parts. I'm going to start in this first part by talking about three reasons I'm a universalist. And then in a follow-up video in a couple days, I'll talk about another couple reasons why I'm a universalist. And one caveat at the outset, I'm going to put up my reasons on a screen beside me, but keep this in mind that I'm presenting them as what we call enthymemes for the most part. So an enthymeme is not a fully stated argument, but often will leave a premise or a conclusion implied rather than stated. It's sort of an abbreviated way of stating an argument, and it might allow the audience then to fill in the blanks as to the full argument itself. So I'm going to present these reasons, these 7 reasons, mostly as enthymemes for conversation to allow people to begin to see why I gradually moved from the twilight of annihilationism into the darkness, or perhaps the sunrise, depending on your perspective, of universal restoration, universalism. Okay, here's my first reason. And by the way, I'm not trying to persuade anybody else. I just wanted to give you a view into my reasoning process. You may find this compelling or at least intriguing or not. That's neither here nor there for me. But these are my internal reasons. So, first of all, anything less than universalism entails that God is either impotent or capricious. That's the main point. The idea of impotence, that God cannot accomplish something that God wants to accomplish, that becomes an indictment of the non-universalist Arminian. The person who says, well, God can't, wants to save everybody, but God can't because people perpetually in their free will desire something other than God, and God's hands are simply tied. God cannot save them. That makes God ultimately impotent, that God cannot accomplish something very core that God desires to accomplish. The alternative is that God is capricious. Now, this is the indictment of a non universalist Calvinism. The idea here being that God could save everybody, God could will on Calvinism that everybody wills to repent and be saved, but God chooses not to. God only chooses to save a select subset of the human population. Now, it's very important in Calvinism that you are saved 100% by God's grace and not by any works. In other words, there's nothing desirous in those who are elected to salvation that makes them somehow worthy of being elected to salvation. Rather, it has to be God's own inscrutable will that saves some and leaves others to damnation, or actively wills them to damnation. And that's where this charge of being capricious comes from. Capricious means unpredictable. There's simply no logic in why God saves some and damns others. And if the Arminian non universalist view is a rather disheartening view of God being impotent, unable to save all. The Calvinist view of God being able to save all, but desiring not to, of God capriciously saving some rather than others, is somewhat, I would say, a terrifying view of the divine. The Universalist has neither one of those problems. The Universalist says God is not impotent. God ultimately will restore all creatures to God's self. And God is not capricious. God ultimately does love all and indeed will desire to save all and will save all. So Universalism avoids these twin problems of non-universalist Calvinism and Arminianism. Now, I put in here a somewhat of a footnote in gray font. I said there is intrinsic value in a moral history. Now, that's not part of the argument, but I did think it was worth adding in there because here's a common objection that one might hear. Okay, so God can save everyone and ultimately will save everyone, but if God has that level of power and control and beneficence in his nature, why was there any suffering to begin with? Why was there any evil in the world? If God can ultimately bring about our will to choose right, and God desires to bring about our will to choose right, why did God ever allow a will to choose wrong? Why was there ever a fall? Why is there ever sin and brokenness and suffering in the world? If God has this level both of omnibenevolence or love for all creatures in contrast to Calvinism, and also power over all creatures in contrast to Arminianism, or at least non-universalist versions of each view. And the answer there, I think, is at least part of the answer, is to say that there must be some intrinsic value in a moral history. Now, the analogy I often give here is of climbing to the top of a mountain. If you could, let's say, take a helicopter and get dropped off on the top of a mountain, you then end up on the top of the mountain, able to take in the peak and the surrounding valleys and ridges, the glorious environment, seeing everything around you. But what you don't have on that scenario is the value of having struggled up the mountain. There is intrinsic value in climbing a mountain rather than just getting dropped off the top on a helicopter. And people who have a moral history and a creation that has a moral history in which there has been a period of suffering and loss and pain, but ultimately all is for bringing about the formation of creation in toto, as well as the formation of each individual within creation, so that all ultimately are reconciled to God, that is like a collective climbing the mountain, and there's intrinsic value in that over against simply having been dropped off at the top of the mountain. Now, people may not be obviously completely satisfied with that. And like I said, I'm not trying to persuade everybody, just showing you what my own reasoning is here. What I want to point out is that I think whatever problems the universalist view may have on these issues, it has neither the problem of divine impotence or divine capriciousness, and thus is in those respects superior to non-universalist versions of Arminianism and Calvinism. Okay, let's go to the second version or second argument. Here is the second argument. If God truly is that being than which none greater can be conceived, in other words, if God is a perfect being, which is what it means to say God is that which none greater can be conceived, if that is who God is, then the version of Christianity most likely to be true is the one we would most want to be true. To me, this is a really intriguing argument, and one that is almost impelling for universalism. Let me explain what I mean by this. First of all, let's define something that we would desire to be true. Because some people will right away say, yeah, well, there are many things we desire. Some people desire to be true that you shouldn't want to be true. Like, some guy may say, oh, I want to live on an island with 1,000 beautiful women and, have total sexual license among those 1,000 women. Just because he desires that to be true doesn't mean that's something we ought to desire to be true, right? That's certainly the case. So what we have to talk about is this. What is a rightly ordered desire for something? And all I need for this argument to go forward is to say that the desire that all people ultimately are reconciled to God and saved is a rightly ordered desire, whereas one man having 1,000 women and sexual license among them is not a rightly ordered desire. But desiring that all people be saved is a rightly ordered desire. And here you see another great footnote, essentially, and this is again a reference to that J.I. Packer quote that I referenced earlier. So when Packer says, if you want to see people damned, there's something wrong with you, I agree with him 100%. There is something disordered about desiring that universalism be false. So we ought to hope that universalism is true. But then I simply present you the concept of God as the most perfect being, that being than which none greater could be conceived. And I ask you, if God truly is that kind of being, a being than which none greater could be conceived, would we not expect that the version of reality most likely to be true is the one we would most want to be true when our orders are right, our desires are rightly ordered. And I would say, yes, it is. So if our desires rightly ordered desire the reconciliation and restoration of all creatures ultimately, then that is indeed what should be the case, what we should expect to be the case. Now, there's a similar objection here, just like in the first point with the value of an intrinsic moral history, like asking, well, why didn't God ultimately just create all creatures saved at the beginning, right? Like reconciled, restored, sanctified without any need for a fall or suffering and so on. Here, you can likewise say, would creatures not desire to be true that none suffer? And if that is the case, then shouldn't it be that none suffer if God truly is that being than which none greater to be conceived? And I see that that's a reasonable objection, except another point you have to keep in mind is you have to begin with the data you have available to you. So what I would say is part of the data we have available to us is that suffering exists. Creatures do suffer. There's such a thing as what you can call natural evil in the world. Given that there is natural evil in the world, and it seems if we are going to believe that there is a being than which none greater can be conceived, the next question is, well, then what ought we to hope about the ultimate nature of reality, or given that there's this being than which none greater be conceived? And that's where universalism comes in. It's not that there would be no suffering, but that though there is suffering, all will be ultimately delivered from it. All right, let's go to the third argument. This one is one I'm sure that's not going to persuade a lot of people, but it is persuasive to me, particularly given over against the infernalist or eternal conscious torment option. So the argument is this: the true Christian doctrine is Christ formative. What that means is that a doctrine, if it is true, then believing that doctrine will make you more like Jesus, or at least will not detract from your formation to becoming more like Jesus. And I believe universalism is Christ formative, because universalism is rooted both in hope and in desire for the beneficence and blessing of all creatures. But there's something malformative. As again, J.I. Packer said, if you want to see people damned, there's something wrong with you. That if you're not desiring, at least for the hope of universalism, that is malformative in you. If you desire even more for the eternal conscious torment of some creatures, that is even more malformative. But rather desiring for the repentance and restoration of all creatures, that is Christ formative. So belief in universalism makes you more like Jesus. It forms your will rightly. And I believe there is that close connection between the truth of a doctrine and the moral formation the doctrine or the belief in the doctrine brings about in an individual. So those are my first three arguments in favor of universalism. In part two of my video, I'm going to conclude with a final 4 points.
And let's see if we can find part 2. And here is part 2. Make sure we're at 125.
The other day I posted this video, why I am a Universalist now. And in this video, I gave 3 reasons why I am a Christian Universalist, by which I mean that I believe ultimately all people or all creatures will be reconciled to God in Jesus Christ, whether in this life or in some period of posthumous restorative judgment in the next life. In that video, I noted that there would be a part 2 in which I would give an additional 4 reasons why I am a Universalist. And that brings us to this video, why I am a Universalist part 2. I'm actually going to give, I think, 5 reasons. First thing is I've linked the original video below so you can get caught up on those reasons. And I've also linked below an interview I did with philosopher Miles Donoghue talking about the problems with the infernalist view of hell. That just came online, so I'm linking that as well in case you're interested. But let's take a look at my additional 5 reasons why I am a Universalist. First of all is number 4. A reasonable biblical case can be made for universalism. Now let's be clear on what I'm saying here. Christians disagree about all sorts of things. They disagree about how the church should be organized. Some people look to the Bible and they say it supports a congregational model of church polity. Some say it supports an Episcopal or a Presbyterial model of church polity. Christians also disagree about the nature of baptism. Should it be for believers or infants? Christians interpret the Bible differently on that matter. Christians disagree on whether to be Calvinists or Arminians in terms of election and providence. They disagree on their view of the millennium. There's a premillennial, postmillennial, and amillennial views of Revelation chapter 20. And on and on and on. There are endless theological topics on which Christians disagree. And what's interesting, is that I think for most of these topics and debates, a reasonable case can be made for one or another theological view. Well, what's going on here? What's going on here is that people don't simply come to their theology through the Bible. They come to their theology by reading the Bible, influenced and informed by other extra biblical sources, including what is called in the Wesleyan quadrilateral reason, tradition, and experience. And when you have those external sources, you then will look at the Bible and seemingly disparate or conflicting witnesses within the Bible, and you will typically select one set of texts within that debate as your control texts by which you will interpret the other texts. So, for example, if you are a Calvinist, you will focus, let's say, on passages that talk about God's freedom and determining will in election, like you find in Romans 9. If you are an Arminian, you're going to begin with passages that talk about God's universal love for all creatures, like 1 Timothy 2:4 or John 3:16. And you're going to interpret the other passages in light of your set of control texts. And this is why Christians can end up disagreeing reasonably about various theological topics. The same thing is true when it comes to the debate about universal salvation. I think a reasonable case can be made for the eternal conscious torment view from the Bible. One could look, for example, to Matthew 25:41 and 46, where Jesus seems to talk about eternal punishment. If you're an annihilationist, one could look to Matthew 10:28, where Jesus seems to talk about the destruction of person, body, and soul in hell. And if you're a universalist, you could look to passages like Colossians 1:20, where Jesus talks about all things being reconciled to God in Jesus Christ, whether things in heaven or things on earth. And you could look to Philippians 2:11, talks about everything, every knee bowing and tongue confessing Jesus Christ is Lord. And many other passages would likewise seem to support universalism. Once you get to that point and you realize that a reasonable case can be made for universalism, you recognize that ultimately to resolve this debate, universalism is in the game, and you have to look to these other external extra-biblical sources in order to determine ultimately how best to interpret and theologize the Bible. So to say, number 4, a reasonable case can be made for universalism is just to say universalism can meet that minimal threshold that we would expect of any defensible theological position. Number 5, a reasonable historical case can be made for universalism. A history or tradition is not infallible. There can be long traditions of theological thinking which can be wrong, clearly. But nonetheless, tradition is important and does root or give an anchor to various theological positions. And so it is significant that while universalism is a minority witness in Christian history, it nonetheless is well represented in Christian history, particularly in the patristic era. And not just from controversial theologians like Origen, but from theologians like 4th century Nicene theologian Gregory of Nyssa, who was one of the greatest pillars of orthodoxy in the 4th century church and was also a Christian universalist. In fact, universalism arguably was the predominant view of the Eastern Orthodox patristic church. While it has been a minority witness throughout most of Christian history, there is a significant and reasonable historical case to be made for it, and that is another factor in my shift in conversion and conviction. Number 6, heaven makes the most sense if universalism is true. Now, when I say heaven here, really what I'm meaning is a new heaven and new earth, or what I believe is a reconciled and restored and resurrected creation. I've talked about that in other books, such as my book, What on Earth Do We Know About Heaven? We'll leave that aside for now. I just want to make this one central point. The way that other views, particularly the infernalist or eternal conscious torment view, view hell, they really struggle with making sense of hell. And there are 2 main ways that infernalists think about hell. First of all, let me set up those 2 ways by presenting the dilemma that the infernalist faces. The dilemma is this. In heaven, we are supposed to have every tear wiped away from our eyes, Revelation 21:4, and to enjoy a maximally blessed and peaceful and joyous existence. But how could that be the case if an indeterminate number of our loved ones, friends, and family are suffering unimaginable torment and anguish in hell? How does that make sense? There are 2 primary responses that infernalists have provided to that question. One response is to say that God will mask or shield the suffering and anguish of hell from us. And it is only because of that that we can enjoy the pleasures of heaven. But that just doesn't make sense. It turns heaven into something like a matrix in which we can only find joy and pleasure in the next life because the agonies of that same life that run parallel to us are shielded from us. In one of my books, I give the illustration. It's like going to a resort in the developing world, and the only way that you can enjoy the pleasures of the resort by poolside is because there are high enough walls that block out all the agony of people dying and suffering in the streets right outside. And surely that cannot be what heaven is. Heaven just being a place where we can enjoy it because the agonies of hell are shielded from us. And that's why the predominant view among infernalists when it comes to thinking about the relationship between heaven and hell has been a schadenfreude view. In other words, people will not have hell shielded from them, but rather they will have awareness of the suffering of those in hell. And in fact, that suffering will increase their own sense of blessedness and the glory of God. How can that be true, you're wondering? Well, they'll say two things. First of all, witnessing loved ones suffering in hell will illustrate the justice of God. And because people will be witnessing the justice of God through God's pouring out of wrath and torment on the reprobate or the damned, they will experience the joy of witnessing God's justice. Second is they will also have the contrast effect that they too could have been those objects of wrath, but they will have pleasure knowing that they are in fact objects of God's mercy, and that too will increase their joy in heaven. I will just say that this view, which has been defended by Christians from Tertullian to Thomas Aquinas to Jonathan Edwards to John Piper and J.I. Packer, I find this view to be morally grotesque. So the fact that as a universalist, you do not have to accept that kind of cognitive dissonance view, either heaven is essentially a delusion or heaven is you taking in the joy of those in hell. The fact that you can avoid all of those is a very strong argument in favor of universalism, although admittedly, this also to some degree is an argument for annihilationism. The last arguments, however, are specifically for universalism. Number 7 is it's wrong to punish people who are fundamentally behaving in an irrational way. Now, this is a very familiar principle to us in jurisprudence. If a person is just irrational and delusional, then what they need is treatment rather than punishment. If a person, for example, they kill another person because they were having a psychotic break from reality and they were perceiving that person as an external threat, then the response is not to punish them for the action, but to give them treatment. What could be more irrational than a person who rejects the fundamental source of all happiness, joy, being, and goodness, and chooses instead to inflict upon themselves maximal misery and anguish? The person who chooses hell is by definition engaging in the most fundamentally irrational action. And if it is wrong to punish people for those kinds of irrational actions, it would be wrong to punish people in the maximal irrational action. Now, this can be cashed out both with respect to annihilationism and eternal conscious torment. On eternal conscious torment, it's clearly wrong to torture people. That's just another argument I could present, by the way, but let's keep our arguments in check here. Can only have so many. It's wrong to torture people, but how much wronger is it? How much more wrong is it to torture somebody who is fundamentally irrational and delusional? And yet eternal conscious torment proposes that God tortures people forever. But annihilationism also proposes that God kills people who are engaged in a fundamentally irrational, delusional action. And that too is fundamentally wrong. The only view that makes sense to me is the view where God works with people who are engaged in a fundamentally irrational, delusional action to bring about restored relationship and remove and strip away their delusions, allow them to see reality. And if you, here's another point I would want to make, which really could be another argument, but if you cannot imagine how God could strip away a person's delusions, heal their brain chemistry, and bring them to a point of repentance and restoration, then I think you have an inadequate grasp of what divine omnipotence or God being all-powerful could accomplish. So let's now turn to point 8, which is related to point 7, but a little different. At some point, one ought to prevent irrational people from carrying out self-destructive choices. A final eternal hell is by definition the most self-destructive choice possible. Therefore, one ought to prevent irrational people from choosing a final eternal hell. Here, the focus is not on hell being a punishment and it being wrong to punish people who are fundamentally irrational. Rather, the focus is on our obligation to be merciful to people who are choosing a self-destructive course of action and to prevent them from engaging in that course of action. Now, there are times where we believe a person has the right to engage in an irrational action. Let's say that you think smoking is a fundamentally irrational action. You nonetheless think at some point a person has the right to smoke and we should not prevent them from engaging in that fundamentally irrational action. But what if a person takes a knife and starts hacking themselves, stabbing themselves? Would you not think it makes sense to prevent them, physically restrain them, so that they cannot harm themselves in that immediate, extreme, extraordinary degree? And I would say yes. Just because a person chooses to stab themselves doesn't mean you can stand aside and say, well, they're choosing that for themselves. They've got free will. No, at some point you would restrain their free will to inflict that kind of irreparable harm upon themselves and bring them to a point where they can understand what is happening and no longer do that to themselves. Hell would be the maximal case of a person inflicting suffering upon themselves, choosing to submit themselves to suffering. And if we would intervene, if a person, let's say, stabs themselves, how much more would you be obliged to intervene and prevent a person from inflicting misery upon themselves through the ultimate self-destructive action of choosing damnation and separation from the source of all light, love, and goodness? So those are 8 reasons, not just 7, but 8 reasons why I am a universalist now. There's actually 1 or 2 other reasons I kind of slipped in there along the way if you were listening closely. I'm not saying that this is all my reasons, but these are some of the significant factors that have persuaded me that universalism is true. And I would appreciate hearing your own comments and thoughts below.
Okay. There you have it. Randal the Universalist. His link is in the description below, and I pinned it over here in the side chat earlier. And have a good day, dude, because we have a good God who is pretty smart as to how he is operating the universe and will get the desired results that he wants, including he will get his desired results with Pope Socks. Dude, bye for now.